As I look once again at a document I found in a disgusting merchandising warehouse in Cairo several years ago, it occurs to me to wonder how much of the wonders of the world we have lost or forgotten today. I highlighted this find in an article I wrote several years ago called Sectarian Standards in Decline. It was published in my present blog on Tuesday the 14th, 2014, and told of Constantine's thoughts in his own writing on the eve of his final meeting of the Nicene Council. However, I find architecture a prime example of those wonders of which I speak. Its magnificence embodies so much of our social and political identity that we take for granted. My own environment is a case in point. For example, secondary analysis of probable data complete. New material found on Richard Perry Baxter, social commentator in the early part of the 21st century. Continuing to examine data presently. Mainframe paused briefly, wondering whether it might be a sensible idea to signal sub-strategist Harcourt Quarry before continuing with the replay. He had requested the search for more information on the subject be continued. Richard Perry Baxter had been a contributing factor to the Great Revolution and subsequent surge of 2567, and it was on the orders of the conglomerate that more data be retrieved on the subject before initiating a temporal intervention. On eventual reflection, Mainframe decided against calling the officer about the fresh information it had found, and decided to scan it for quality of playback before presenting it to him. Proceeding of scanning process requires the use of visual representation despite the absence of organic life, it chimed. Quality of ancient AVI recording is poor, and some syncing issues with visual stimulus is inevitable. A gradual humming of retrieval systems filled the room, and entry code blinked on the otherwise seemingly dull, dead monitors. Initiating. Overlooking the great Bayham Abbey, I was reminded of the conglomeration that formed the magnificent construct. As the pumping of wellsprings hurled themselves through me, knocking over cognitive historical boundaries on his way, I sank into the veins of ancestral tremor. If we look at France, for instance, although there are few instances of architectural splendour outside Tamatours, we do find a couple of interesting snippets. It reflects the splendour of the Second Renaissance during the mid-19th century, when Broadwater Down was compacted with the village to up its population. The Royal Oak Pub is a particular example of this, having been subject to obvious renovation during that period. What I really want to harp on about, though, is the wonderfulness that is the station just outside Wadhurst. It is magnificent. Alright, maybe that's overstating it a bit. It says something about my romantic and nostalgic nature that I cannot go past Wadhurst and not travel up Mayfield Lane, where I used to live as a boy. When I was around 5 or 6, actually I think it was probably 7, I found myself left by accident in Wadhurst town centre. The first time I remember walking home to Mayfield Lane on my own. Now, when you're that age, you cannot appreciate the Normanesque Victorian reconstructions of the wall that herald the pavement along the walkway up to the War Memorial in the centre of town. However, I'm much more cultured now. Well, I like to think so anyway. Ticehurst House on the outskirts of the village is another example of the way in which the Second World War requisitioned virtually everything. This wall that separated the road from the park beyond should have a break in it somewhere, and I used to clamber through. I've already mentioned it's strange in this day and age how so much can be so deceptive. Glancing around me at the village of Hawkhurst that I now come into, I reflect how idyllic it looks, yet despite its attractiveness it harbours a history of manipulation and deception. Not that these things have led to any great horror. Having scrambled across East Sussex and back into Kent, I now find myself reflecting on such impressions as are given by the splendid village of Hawkhurst. I trek through my ancient haunts like Ticehurst and Wadhurst and eventually find myself here, Looking at the 19th century architecture of most of the buildings, it remains interesting to reflect that most of them are modern compared to the brilliance that precedes them. Orcus, being so near to Hastings, was a smuggling village as far back as the 15th century and cast a visage of its antecedents upon disappointing little of its remaining architecture. Looking around me as I blunder out of Orcus into the territory that hasn't been explored in 8 years or so, I make my way to Etchingham Station, taking in the gorgeousness of both Normanesque beauties of St James's Church and St Lawrence's Church on the way. It seems to me that the further you remove from the now cosmopolitan nature of bustling towns like Tunbridge Wells and Maidstone, the more a flavour is palatable, giving a taste of what Kent and Sussex have to offer. Its architecture a large part of that tremor I felt on my last visit to Bayham Abbey. Scan complete. Several inconsistencies were found conflicting with known data on subject. However, no unexpected structural damage to footage was apparent. Mainframe paused, considering its next observation. It wasn't programmed to notice objectionable literary or distasteful art, but this had to be commented on. Several arrogant incursions into the observations of recording observed. This system finds them objectionable, storing data for retrieval at the request of sub-strategist Harcourt. With a small blip and a decreasing hum, the room fell silent again. The blanket of darkness again continued to be absolute.
Terrible.